So, welcome everybody to another edition of the Joy Score podcast with Connie Rose, our happiness and addiction coach, and Dr. Joy. And today's subject is going to be relationship patterns, recognizing them, and I guess the types of relationship patterns that exist. And I think this is an interesting one because we see it in everyday life. We see it in friendships and the people that we care about. We see them kind of in these cycles of behavior, and from an outsider it seems so obvious, and while you're in them, I guess there's a lot of psychological processes that keep you in that place. So talk to us a little bit about that, Connie, as far as like maybe the different types of relationship patterns that could exist, or perhaps the reason why from an outsider it seems so obvious, but to the person they seem so locked in and stuck. How does that happen?
I think it's always easier to analyze someone else rather than yourself. But through the process of meditation, I think you do become way more aware of your own patterns. But relationship patterns tend to start in childhood and often will model what we experienced in childhood throughout our life until we become aware of it and we're willing to work on our shadows and the causes and the root cause really of those relationship patterns. You'll learn a relationship pattern based on a caregiver or a sibling or someone that you grew up with, basically.
Right. And I guess you've got sort of defense mechanisms, right, to keep you stuck as well. Like you've kind of got these ritualized behaviors and these ideas of, this is who I am. And some of that, I think, keeps people in their place and stops them looking internally and being brave and taking on these things that are sort of scary in their life or have been scary in the past. And I think that kind of can keep people stuck, right?
Yeah, and also we like, as humans, we tend to go for what we know. So if we grew up with a certain relationship pattern, we will naturally be drawn to that type of relationship throughout our life because that's what's comfortable to us, even if it's very uncomfortable. So, for example, if you've had an abusive parent, you might attract and kind of subconsciously want to work through that type of relationship in other relationships that you're in your life, like romantic or friendship. And I think it's actually a deeper meaning to that, like the soul wanting to really understand that relationship and work through it, because we can only work through things through experience. You can't just read about it and say, okay, done. You have to go through some form of experience to release it.
Right. So what would you say, what would you say is the sort of antidote to being stuck in a negative relationship pattern? It's obviously, looking at it internally and doing the inward work, the introspection. But what are those sort of steps, would you think, to kind of changing the cycle?
I think becoming aware of it is number one, and looking at what's behind the reason of why you not want to, but why you are in those types of relationships. Often it will be connected to your relationship style. So you could be like anxious avoidant, or like there's other relationship patterns that I've forgotten. But it's like hang on a minute, I've lost my train of thought now. What was I saying?
I was saying about the sort of the stages of kind of recognizing and kind of getting out of the loop of being in this, being sort of stuck. So the first step is kind of recognizing and acknowledging, and then kind of doing the self work. But do you think it's do you think it's a question of sort of trying on different strategies for yourself to not do what would come naturally in order to see if you have different outcomes? How do you think you could, change embedded behavior?
I think it's about going into your shadow, really, which is what we're going to talk about more next week. But it's like your shadow is often, there's like 3 types of shadow normally that's all your issues stem from. It's like, and one is the feeling of not feeling good enough. So often, like, if you don't feel good enough, you'll cling on to relationships, or you'll behave in a certain way that is related to not feeling good enough. Or you might have, and that stems from childhood. And then, or you might have trust issues. So you might push people away or be very jealous. And that comes from that shadow. And there's another shadow.
It's interesting you talk about this starting in childhood. So what age do we, or do most people, establish their character that they live with?
The first 4 years are very, very important about what you like to in.
First 3 to 5 years is where you form it.
Yeah.
So before you reach the age of 5, you have essentially established.
Not entirely. No, definitely.
Not entirely, but
you will learn a lot in
right.
your formative years of development, which is your teens in
right.
your teens. But obviously we're always learning, but we're most influenced from those essential years when our brain is still forming, really.
Yeah, like some sense of, for instance, insecurity. That can develop early on, and things of that nature which are part of you. You can overcome anything, but that is very interesting how one of the books I was reading, it talks about how it is developed in the first 5 years, and it stays with you.
Yeah.
What I find interesting as well is when people are in these kind of negative cycles, and I know it's a bit of a defense mechanism, but they tend to fall back on, well, this is just who I am.
Yeah.
Rather than actually sort of looking at it and saying, well, is that really working for you? Is this, do you want to stay in this position? It's like, I know some people that have some fundamental traits, and you can all, and they haven't necessarily had the most successful relationship track history, and I can see it from the outside as because of these fundamental traits. And the question is, like, how do you politely, but I don't know, I guess it's not for an outsider to say that, right? Really, is it for it's the person that, as a friend, you want to sort of say it's because of this, but then if they don't listen or
don't want to,
yeah.
I think the best thing to focus on is you, rather than trying to change other people, because when you change you, often some people that are always wanting to change other people, they haven't fully worked on themselves. Obviously, I'm a coach, so people come to me to.
I think what Dave was talking about is like observing something in a friend, and you feel that they suffer from a trait which causes a lot of issues with their relationships. And how do you help them?
Yeah.
Yeah, you can be the example. You can have a great relationship with people that you're in, or with yourself. And then when you talk about your experience, like a light might go off in the head, but like telling someone like, oh, you've got childhood issues, or like, you don't feel good enough about it. Like it can be met with resistance.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Did you see the keywords Soon sent us for this discussion today, Connie?
Yeah.
Anything there you feel you would like to talk about?
What were they again?
I'll pull them up.
I'll read it. First one is intimacy.
Yeah, hang on a minute. Something else I was going to say. So basically, like, there's a theory that we go through, we either have transitionary soulmates or primary soulmates. So the transitionary soulmates are meant to be, you frozen.
No, here, we're listening. We can hear you.
Yeah, okay. So there's a theory that there's transitionary soulmates and primary soulmates. And the transitionary soulmates will be more of a lesson, and they'll be like fiery and either very passionate or dramatic and lots of ups and downs. And that's not necessarily who is your like most ideal match, because you've attracted them to go through that learning. And then as you learn, if you learn the lesson that's in that relationship quickly, you'll be moved up to a much higher lesson, or eventually your primary soulmate, or like one of your primary soulmates. There's not just one, there's many. This is the theory. But it's about learning that lesson and recognizing it quick. For example, like in my life, I've had a lot of power struggles in my relationships. And it wasn't until like I recognized that and decided I'm not going to keep feeding into that dynamic, either giving my power away or like needing power or like feeling very submissive in relationships. And I've been in abusive relationships, which is stemmed from my childhood. But that's, I've resolved a lot with my parents now, and they're great. But it wasn't until I recognized that I was able to move through that and then raise my vibration and feel so much better and attract like easier relationships.
Got it. I mean, it's like, I mean, it is a journey of experience and change and learning. These relationships, and I guess what I was getting at before is this. People can be stuck in these situations, but they have to do the work themselves. Even they can get a therapist to help them do the work, but ultimately it has to come from them.
Yeah.
No amount, like, it's really hard as an outsider to help. You can, because even I've had friends that have tried to help other friends and it's ended friendships because the person wasn't ready to hear it or was defensive or, all of that kind of stuff. Going
to a coach or a therapist is like a fast track to growth, and that is working on yourself.
Yes.
So, and I wouldn't be where I am now without all the help that I've had along the way, but I had to work with my coach and my therapist.
Yeah. Do you think you always have to? Do you think that because like the body is designed with defense mechanisms to prevent you from, or to make it very hard for you to look at these things that scare you, So do you think, to get growth, you always really need someone to reflect that from? Or do you think it is possible to do it solely on your own?
I wouldn't advise doing it on your own. I have a coach now. I actually have 3 coaches and still a therapist. Now I see one coach every week, but there's still always growth, and there's still always like a higher level that you can get to. Yeah, and it's much faster and easier like working with my coach, because it's like I've done so much work, and obviously I am a coach, that I'm able to come to those realizations and just up level really quickly now. And I see my therapist about, I don't know, three times a year probably. So I think at the beginning, you need more of support, because it's like you're mess, like a bundle of mess. Well, I was.
Okay, so so I kind of agree. Like, and maybe. What do you think the role? Do you think it's possible to do this with a good friend, or do you think there's too many like potential boundary issues or issues generally?
Get very tricky if you're doing it with a friend. I think you can be there for a friend, supportive and everything, but often like they've got all their own issues going on. Unless
Right.
I've kind of seen my own parents by often I have tried to use friends as you may call therapists, maybe, by just talking to them. So they don't say anything, they don't respond. You just explain them what's going through your head, and you become clear. By the time you're done talking and explaining, you understand it better than you did before.
Yeah, I mean, just the process of talking. I do recordings, like on my phone, just voice recordings. I'll make a voice recording and then listen back to it. That's a good way to self.
I kind of early on when I started teaching in the early 80s, I remember there'll be some ideas sometimes I'm developing or experimenting with, and I'm not really very clear or comfortable yet. And I'll go and talk to my class about it. And by the time I am done explaining them, I understand what was not clear to me. So it's kind of a self-therapy, so to speak, by explaining someone. So I say, oh, wow, this is very powerful. So I would actually use it with my students. So somebody would come to me and say, look, I didn't understand what you were talking about today. I said, did you understand anything? I said, yeah, a little bit. I said, okay, why don't you explain this person what you understood?
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's like, by the time somebody is done explaining this other person, now I get it. So it's, I don't know, there's something about explaining someone else what's going through your head is in itself therapy,
Definitely.
In fact, sometimes I have seen the therapist would just listen to you and say, okay, the time is up, but didn't say anything.
Yeah, I'm not sure that's a good therapist, though, to be honest.
In these relationships and sort of seeing these things with your friends, you can also be learning about yourself in the same process.
Definitely, everyone can be each other's teacher. The thing about talking to a friend, though, sometimes is that they can just kind of almost. It depends who it is, whether they've studied psychology and got a background in understanding of brain and behavior. But someone that hasn't got that might just encourage another friend in their behavior and be like, "Oh, it's fine," and they'll and try to comfort them. Whereas a coach or therapist, a good one, will call their client out on stuff and be like, "Well, actually, is that correct? And let's look at where that's coming from." And, so that's the difference, really.
Yeah.
And yeah, I guess that's an important thing of what I was sort of driving at with friends helping friends in relationships. It's like you don't necessarily have to encourage bad behavior. You can be there and listen. You can be there, and be supportive and listen. And, you can suggest what's right for you in the form of, maybe you need some help. Maybe that isn't working for you anymore and you take a look at it, that kind of stuff. But you're never actually going to be able to solve that person's problem because that's their work to do.
Yeah, you can't solve someone else's issues without them being willing to work on themselves.
Yeah. And I guess it's like the idea of when do they come to that realization? I can't remember the psychologist that said it, but he basically said you'll change when you've suffered enough.
Yeah.
And that's
and that's different for everyone. Like I see some people who just won't take the lesson. And okay, so how long do you want to keep repeating this?
Right.
How long do you actually want to do it? How deep in the darkness do you need to go to change?
Right.
And it's recognizing that also, because it's like now I recognize things sooner when they come up. Like I'll recognize a power issue sooner than I did before. I don't need to be like in absolute despair anymore. I can see it coming. I see it from a distance more, so that's what gets easier over time. And then eventually you reach enlightenment and you're Buddha, Then you don't need a coach.
Okay, so in trying to sum it up, what would you say, Connie? What would be the way to close this discussion?
I would say, look within, start to try and notice a pattern that has been from your childhood and your relationships and your friendships. What is like the issue that keeps coming up? Are you avoidant? Are you jealous? Are you untrusting? Is there a power dynamic going on? Are you submissive? Do you put too much of your power into a relationship? Do you cling on? Like all these things will show themselves repeating in a repeating way. So that is the thing to look out for. And then the sooner you recognize that, the sooner you can get out of that cycle.